Welcome to my channel. Please like this video and subscribe. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. Brandon Hale stared at the empty side of the bed, feeling a hollow ache in his chest. The clock on the nightstand showed 11:47 p.m. Isa was late again. He ran his hand through his messy hair, wondering when everything had gone so wrong. He could still recall the early days of their marriage, the passion, the laughter, the shared dreams. But now, those memories felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. As Brandon lay there in the darkness, he replayed their last real conversation in his mind. "Kids? Absolutely not," Isa had said, waving her hand dismissively. "I've told you 100 times, Brandon, I don't want to be a mother." Her words had stung, but he tried to brush it off. "I know," he had replied, "but I thought maybe you'd change your mind." Isa's eyes had flashed with irritation. "Well, I haven't." Drop it. And so he had, just like always, avoiding conflict, trying to keep the peace. But as the weeks turned into months, the gap between them grew. Isa started coming home later and later, always with an excuse ready on her lips. The creak of the front door pulled Brandon from his thoughts. He heard Isa's heels click against the hardwood floor, followed by the soft thud as she kicked them off. "Brandon," she called out, "you still up?" He thought about pretending to be asleep, but something pushed him to respond. "Yeah, I'm awake." Isa appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the hallway light. Even after everything, the sight of her still took his breath away. She was stunning tall, with long legs and perfect curves, but there was a coldness in her beauty now, an edge that hadn't been there before. "You didn't have to wait up," she said flatly. Brandon sat up and turned on the bedside lamp. "Where were you?" Isa shrugged, avoiding his eyes as she moved toward the dresser. "Work ran late, you know how it is." The words slipped out before Brandon could stop them. Isa's shoulders stiffened, and she turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Brandon swallowed hard. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers about the late nights and the hushed phone calls, but as usual, he found himself backing down. "Nothing. I'm just tired." Isa's expression softened, but the warmth didn't reach her eyes. "Get some sleep then." "I'm going to take a shower." As she disappeared into the bathroom, Brandon lay back down, his mind racing. Something was wrong. The whispers he had been hearing around town, the way Isa flinched when he touched her, it all added up to something he didn't want to face. But he had to know. The next morning, Brandon woke up alone. Isa was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. She barely glanced up when he entered. "Morning," he said, pouring himself a cup. Isa grunted in response, her eyes still glued to the screen. Brandon leaned against the counter, watching her. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her makeup flawless as usual, but the dark circles under her eyes were poorly hidden by concealer. "Isa," he said softly, his voice low, "we need to talk." She looked up then, her blue eyes cautious. "About what?" Brandon took a deep breath. "About us. About what's happening to our marriage." Isa set her phone down with a sigh. "There's nothing to talk about, Brandon." "We're fine, are we?" He stepped closer, searching her face for any sign of the woman he'd fallen in love with. "You're never home. You barely look at me anymore. It feels like I'm living with a stranger." For a brief moment, something like guilt flickered across Isa's face, but it quickly vanished, replaced by a cool indifference. "You're being dramatic. I've just been busy with work." Brandon opened his mouth to protest, but Isa cut him off. "I have to go. I'm late for a meeting." She brushed past him, leaving behind the scent of her perfume. The front door slammed, and then there was silence. Brandon stood there for a long time, his coffee growing cold in his hands. The suspicion in his gut was growing stronger by the day, but he kept pushing it down, hoping he was just being paranoid. Days passed, each one more strained than the last. Brandon found himself observing Isa more closely, searching for any clue that might explain her behavior. He noticed the way she guarded her phone, the hushed conversations that abruptly ended when he walked into the room. One evening, as they sat in tense silence over dinner, Isa suddenly spoke. "I'm pregnant." Brandon's fork clattered against his plate. He stared at her, sure he had misunderstood. Isa met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I said I'm pregnant." The world seemed to tilt. Brandon gripped the edge of the table, his mind spinning. "But how?" he stammered. "We haven't." His voice trailed off, and Isa's voice took on a sharp edge. Haven't touched each other in months. Is that what you were going to say?" Brandon nodded, too shocked to respond. Isa's eyes flashed with anger. "So what? Are you accusing me of cheating?" "No, I don't know," Brandon stammered. "I'm just trying to understand what?" Isa snapped, standing up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "That sometimes things happen? That maybe your memory isn't as reliable as you think it is?" Brandon shook his head, confusion and hurt swirling inside him. "Isa, please. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just shocked. You've always said you didn't want kids people change," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "Or is that too hard for you to grasp?" Her words stung and Brandon flinched. He watched as she paced the kitchen, her movements jerky and frustrated. "You know what I think?" she hissed, turning to face him. "I think you've been looking for an excuse. You've wanted out of this marriage for a long time, haven't you?" "What? No, that's not true," Brandon protested, his voice shaking. "Don't lie to me." Isa slammed her hand on the counter, her eyes blazing. "You're trying to use this to get rid of me. Well, guess what? It's not going to work. This baby is yours, Brandon, whether you like it or not." With that, Isa stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Brandon reeling in her wake. As the days passed, Brandon's world became clouded by confusion and doubt. Isa's mood swings were erratic. One moment she would be cold and distant, and the next she'd cling to him, tearfully insisting that he still loved her. But beneath it all, a seed of suspicion had taken root in Brandon's mind. He found himself scrutinizing every interaction, every word. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that something was off. Late one night, as Isa slept, Brandon made a decision. With trembling hands, he ordered a DNA test kit online. As he clicked confirm order, a mix of guilt and determination washed over him. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. When the kit arrived, Brandon hid it in his office, biding his time and waiting for the right opportunity. That moment came sooner than expected. Isa burst into the living room one evening, her face flushed with excitement. The doctor called. "We're having a boy." Brandon forced a smile, even as his heart clenched. That's great." Honey, Isa's eyes narrowed. "You don't sound very thrilled." "I am," Brandon lied. "It's just a lot to process." Isa's mood shifted instantly. "Oh, here we go again. You still don't believe me, do you?" "Isa, please, I'm trying." "Trying what?" she sneered. "Trying to find a way out? Well, good luck with that. You can't do it in court, you know. This baby is yours, and you'll just have to deal with that." As Isa stormed off, Brandon felt something inside him harden. The love he once had for her was dissolving, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. He was going to get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. That night, as Isa slept, Brandon quietly collected a DNA sample. With shaking hands, he packaged it, knowing that once he sent it off, there would be no going back. In the days that followed, Brandon began to withdraw emotionally. He went through the motions, attending doctor's appointments and nodding along as Isa talked about the nursery, but inwardly he was building walls, bracing himself for the truth the test would reveal. Isa seemed to sense the change in him, and her manipulations became more blatant, her threats more frequent. "You're stuck with me now," she'd say with a cruel smile. "Better get used to it." Brandon stayed silent, biding his time. The old Brandon might have argued, might have tried to reason with her, but the new Brandon, forged in the fires of betrayal and doubt, simply waited. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the email arrived. Brandon stared at his phone, his heart pounding. Taking a deep breath, he opened the message. As he read the results, the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. The child was his biologically and undeniably his, but instead of relief, a wave of cold fury washed over him. In that moment, he understood the extent of Isa's manipulation. It wasn't just about infidelity. She had played an elaborate psychological game, making him doubt his own mind. Brandon glanced up from his phone to see Isa watching him from across the room, a gleam of triumph in her eyes, as if she knew exactly what he had just discovered. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. Brandon met her gaze, his expression neutral. "Everything's fine," he lied smoothly. Satisfied, Isa turned away, and Brandon felt something shift inside him. The last remnants of love he had for her were gone, replaced by cold, calculating anger. Isa thought she had all the power, that she had trapped him, but she had no idea what was coming. Brandon would have his revenge, and when it came, it would be devastating. He watched Isa move around the room, humming to herself, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. Let her think she had won, he thought. The game was far from over. Brandon sat at his desk, staring at the DNA test results on the computer screen, the words blurring as he read them for the 100th time. The child was his, there was no denying that. But instead of feeling reassured, cold fury filled his veins. He heard Isa's footsteps approaching and quickly closed the browser. She appeared in the doorway, resting one hand on her slightly swollen belly. "What have you been doing in here all day?" she asked, her tone overly light but with an edge of suspicion. Brandon turned in his chair to face her. "Just work stuff," he replied. Isa narrowed her eyes. "Really? Because your boss called earlier and said you haven't been in the office all week." For a moment, panic gripped Brandon, but he quickly masked it. "I've been working remotely," he said smoothly. "You know how it is with this project." Right, Isa drawled, clearly unconvinced. She strolled into the room, perching on the edge of his desk. "If there's something you need to tell me, now's the time," she purred. Brandon met her gaze, holding it steadily. "What makes you think I have something to tell you?" Isa leaned in closer, her perfume overwhelming his senses. "Call it a woman's intuition," she whispered. "You've been acting different lately, distant." "Have I?" Brandon asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I thought I was just giving you space, for the baby." A flicker of something, perhaps annoyance or worry, crossed Isa's face, but it vanished quickly, replaced by a sugary smile. "That's sweet of you, honey," she cooed, "but you don't need to do that. We're in this together." Remember, she reached out to touch his face, but Brandon flinched away instinctively. Hurt flashed briefly in Isa's eyes before it was replaced by anger. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she snapped. Brandon stood up, putting some distance between them. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just tired." Isa spat. "You've been avoiding me for weeks, barely touching me, hardly speaking to me. If you have something to say, just say it." The tension in the room was thick, and Brandon's heart raced. The truth was on the tip of his tongue, but he knew the time wasn't right. "I don't have anything to say, Isa," he said quietly, his voice calm and measured. "Maybe you're the one who has something to tell me." Isa's face paled slightly, but she quickly recovered, her composure intact. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice sharp. Brandon shrugged, turning back to his computer. "Nothing," Brandon replied, his voice calm. "Like I said, I'm just tired." He could hear Isa's sharp intake of breath, and he could practically feel the anger rolling off her. But when she spoke again, her tone was unnervingly composed, almost patronizing. "You need a break, honey. All this work is obviously getting to you. Why don't you go lie down? I'll make us some dinner." Brandon didn't respond, keeping his eyes locked on the screen. After a moment, Isa huffed and left the room. As soon as she was gone, Brandon exhaled shakily. He pulled up the DNA test results again, staring at the undeniable truth of Isa's deception. The anger that had been simmering within him for weeks threatened to boil over. He thought back to all the times Isa had gaslit him, making him question his own sanity, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the sudden shift in her desire to have children. It all made sense now. She had orchestrated this from the start. Brandon's hands balled into fists. He had been a fool blinded by love and trust, but not anymore. It was time to confront Isa with the truth. He found her in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a fury. She didn't even glance at him as he entered. "Isa," he began, his voice steady, "we need to talk." She set the knife down and turned to face him, an exasperated sigh escaping her. "What now, Brandon?" He took a deep breath, preparing himself. "I know about the baby." Isa rolled her eyes. "Of course you know about the baby. I told you months ago." "No," Brandon said, his tone hardening. "I know the truth about the baby." For a brief moment, fear flashed in Isa's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by indignation. "What are you talking about?" Brandon pulled out his phone and opened the DNA test results. "I had a paternity test done, Isa." The color drained from Isa's face. "You what?" "You heard me," Brandon replied coldly. "I know the baby is mine, biologically at least, but—" Her shock quickly morphed into fury. "How dare you go behind my backhand?" Don't, Brandon interrupted, his voice sharp. Don't even try to turn this around on me. You've been lying to me for months, manipulating me. Isa's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape, but when she spoke, her voice was oddly calm. So what if I did? The baby is yours. You can't prove anything else. A chill ran down Brandon's spine at her casual admission. Why, Isa? Why would you do this? She laughed, a harsh and bitter sound. Because I could, Brandon. You were so easy to manipulate, so desperate to believe in our perfect little life. The cruelty in her voice shocked Brandon. This wasn't the woman he had married, or maybe she was, and he had been too blind to see it. You never wanted children, he whispered, barely audible. Isa shrugged. People change. Or at least that's what I needed you to believe. So this was all just a game to you, Brandon asked, his anger rising. Our marriage, our life together. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Isa sneered. It wasn't all bad, was it? You got what you wanted, a baby on the way, a perfect little family. Brandon shook his head, disgust boiling inside him. You're unbelievable. Isa's eyes narrowed dangerously. No, what's unbelievable is that you thought you could outsmart me. Did you really think a DNA test would change anything? She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. Let me make this clear, Brandon. This baby is yours. Legally, biologically, in every way that matters. And if you think you can walk away, you're in for a rude awakening. Brandon's heart raced, but he held his ground. Is that a threat? Isa smiled coldly, a calculating look on her face that made Brandon's skin crawl. It's a promise. Try to leave and I'll take you for everything you have. Child support, alimony, the house, everything. After all, I have to think about what's best for our child. Brandon stared at her, barely recognizing the woman in front of him. The Isa he thought he knew was gone, replaced by this cold, manipulative stranger. You won't get away with this, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Isa laughed, the sound grating on his nerves. Oh, honey, I already have. Face it, Brandon, you can't win. It's your word against mine, and I've got biology on my side. She turned back to the counter, picked up the knife, and resumed chopping. Now, why don't you make yourself useful and set the table? Dinner will be ready soon. Brandon stood there, frozen in disbelief. The casual way Isa dismissed him, as if their entire world hadn't just crumbled, enraged him. But beneath the anger, a cold determination was taking root. He wouldn't let her win, not like this. Without a word, Brandon turned and left the kitchen. He could hear Isa calling after him, her voice a mix of anger and mockery, but he ignored her. In the safety of his office, Brandon locked the door and sank into his chair, his mind racing. He began piecing together everything that had happened in the past few months, every lie, every manipulation, every calculated move Isa had made. He pulled out a notepad and started writing down every suspicious incident he could remember: the late nights at the office, the hushed phone conversations, unexplained charges on their credit card. As the list grew longer, a grim sense of satisfaction filled him. Isa thought she held all the cards, but she had underestimated him. Brandon opened his laptop and began digging deeper. He combed through their financial records, finding discrepancies he had missed before: large withdrawals from their joint account, transfers to an unfamiliar account. As the night wore on, Brandon's resolve only strengthened. He wouldn't be a victim in Isa's twisted game. He would fight back and he would win. The next morning, Brandon woke early. He hadn't slept much, his mind buzzing with plans and strategies. He found Isa in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. Morning, he said, keeping his voice neutral. Isa looked up, surprise flickering across her face. You're up early. Brandon shrugged, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Couldn't sleep. Listen, Brandon, Isa began, her voice hesitant, about last night. Don't, Brandon cut her off. I don't want to hear it. Isa's eyes narrowed. We need to talk about this. No, we don't, Brandon said firmly. You made yourself perfectly clear last night. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. He turned to leave, but Isa's voice stopped him. Work? Since when do you care so much about work? Brandon glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. People change, Isa. Isn't that what you said? Without waiting for a response, he left the kitchen. He could feel her eyes burning into his back, but he didn't care. Let her wonder, let her worry. It was her turn to feel uncertain. In the following weeks, Brandon threw himself into his secret project. By day, he maintained the appearance of normal life, going to work, attending doctor's appointments with Isa, discussing nursery colors. But by night, he worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and preparing his case. He hired a private investigator to follow Isa and document her every move. He consulted a lawyer, quietly exploring his options. All the while, he played the role of the resigned husband, giving Isa no indication that her world was about to come crashing down. Isa, for her part, seemed to relax as the weeks went by. She clearly believed she had won, that Brandon had accepted his fate. Her taunts became more frequent, her confidence growing by the day. "You know," Isa said one evening, as they sat on the couch watching TV, "I've been thinking about baby names. How do you feel about Brandon Jr.?" Brandon felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Whatever you want." Isa, she laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that made Brandon grit his teeth. "That's right, whatever I want. You're finally getting it, aren't you?" Brandon stayed silent, his eyes glued to the TV, but inside his resolve solidified. Soon, he promised himself. Soon she'd learn just how wrong she was. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Brandon's preparations were complete. He had amassed a thick folder of evidence, financial records, witness statements, even recordings of Isa's threats. His lawyer assured him they had a strong case. On a bright Tuesday morning, Brandon woke with an odd sense of calm. Today was the day. He found Isa in the nursery, folding tiny baby clothes. "Isa," he said, his voice steady, "we need to talk." She turned, a skeptical expression on her face. "What is it now?" Brandon handed her a thick manila envelope. "I think you'll want to look at this." Confusion flickered across Isa's face as she opened the envelope and began to read. Brandon watched the color drain from her cheeks. What is this?" she stammered. "It's over, Isa," Brandon said, his tone cold. "I'm filing for divorce." Isa's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious. You can't do this." "I can, and I am," Brandon replied calmly. "All the necessary documents are in that envelope. My lawyer will be in touch with yours." Isa's shock quickly turned to fury. She lunged at him, grabbing his shirt with both hands. "You bastard! You think you can just walk away? I'll ruin you?" Brandon caught her wrists, holding her at arm's length. "No, Isa, you won't. Take a closer look at those papers. I have evidence of your infidelity, your financial misconduct, and recordings of your threats. If you try to fight this, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Isa staggered back, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. You've been planning this all along?" Brandon nodded, a grim smile playing on his lips. "I learned from the best, didn't I?" He turned to leave, but Isa's voice stopped him. "What about the baby?" she asked, her tone desperate. "You can't just abandon your child." Brandon looked back at her, his expression ice cold. "The baby will stay with you, Isa? Isn't that what you wanted? To trap me with a child I never asked for? Well, congratulations, you got what you wanted. The child is all yours." With that, he walked out of the nursery, ignoring Isa's screams of anger and desperation. As he left the house, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't over yet. He knew Isa wouldn't go down without a fight, but for the first time in months, Brandon felt like he was in control. He got into his car and took one last look at the house he had once considered his home. As he drove away, he allowed himself a small smile. Isa had taught him a painful lesson about trust and betrayal. Now it was her turn to learn. The game wasn't over, but Brandon was no longer playing by Isa's rules, and he intended to win. Brandon sat in his lawyer's office, papers spread across the desk in front of him. The past few weeks had been a blur of legal meetings, negotiations, and heated confrontations, but today it would all finally come to an end. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Hale?" his lawyer, Sarah, asked. She was a no-nonsense woman, her sharp gaze studying him. "Once you sign these, there's no going back." Brandon nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "I'm sure. Let's finish this." As he picked up the pen, his mind flashed back to the day he served Isa with the divorce papers. The shock on her face had almost made up for all the pain she had caused him. "You can't do this," Isa had screamed, her face twisted with fury. "I'll fight you every step of the way." Brandon had remained calm, his voice steady. "Go ahead and try, Isa, but I think you'll find I'm not the pushover you thought I was." Now, weeks later, Isa's defiance had crumbled under the weight of the evidence Brandon had gathered. The courts had seen through her manipulations and lies. As Brandon signed the final document, he felt a huge burden lift. It was done. He was free. "Congratulations," Mr. Hale, Sarah said, gathering up the papers. "The divorce is finalized. Miss Hale will be served with the papers today." Brandon stood and shook her hand. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." As he left the office, Brandon pulled out his phone. He had one more loose end to tie up. "Hello, Mr. Johnson. This is Brandon Hale. I need you to initiate the final phase of our plan." "Yes, immediately." He ended the call, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Isa thought the divorce was the end of it. She had no idea what was coming. Brandon drove to the house, now legally his, and waited. It didn't take long. Within an hour, Isa's car screeched into the driveway. She stormed up to the door, pounding on it with both fists. "Brandon, open this door right now, you bastard." He let her stew in her anger for a few moments before finally opening the door. Isa burst inside, waving a stack of papers in his face. "What the hell is this?" she shrieked. "The house, the cars, our savings, everything's gone. How did you do this?" Brandon leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "I didn't do anything, Isa. You did this to yourself." Isa's face turned red with rage. "Don't give me that. You manipulated the courts. You turned everyone against me." "No, Isa," Brandon said, his voice hard as steel. "I just showed them the truth about the affairs, the financial fraud, the psychological manipulation. Did you really think you could get away with it?" Isa's anger deflated, replaced by desperation. But what about the baby? You can't just leave us with nothing." Brandon's expression didn't change. "The baby will stay with you, just like you wanted? Isn't that why you did all of this? To trap me with a child? Well, now you have everything you wanted." Isa's voice cracked. "You can't do this," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Where are we supposed to go?" Brandon shrugged, completely unmoved. "That's not my problem anymore, Isa. You made your choices, now you have to live with them." He watched as the reality of her situation sunk in. Isa's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Brandon," she begged, looking up at him through tear-filled eyes. "Don't do this. We can work something out for the baby's sake." For a brief moment, Brandon felt a flicker of pity, but he quickly squashed it, remembering all her lies and manipulation. "No, Isa. We can't. It's over." He stepped around her and headed for the door. "You have until the end of the week to move out. After that, the locks will be changed." As he walked out, Isa's sobs echoed through the empty house, but Brandon didn't look back. He couldn't afford to show any weakness now. Over the next few days, Brandon watched from a distance as Isa's life fell apart. She was evicted from the house, her luxury car repossessed, and the so-called friends who had been drawn to her former wealth and status quickly abandoned her. Brandon had been meticulous in his vengeance. He cancelled their shared credit cards, froze their joint accounts, and ensured every asset was either in his name or liquidated. Isa was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby on the way. A week after the divorce was finalized, Brandon got a call from his private investigator. "Mr. Hale, I've got an update for you. Miss Hale has moved into a small apartment on the east side of town. It's not a great neighborhood." Brandon nodded, even though the investigator couldn't see him. "And her financial situation?" he asked. "Not good, sir. She's working a minimum wage job at a local diner, barely making ends meet." "Thank you," Brandon said, ending the call. He leaned back in his chair, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him felt grim satisfaction at Isa's downfall, but another part, one he tried to ignore, felt a pang of guilt. Shaking his head, he pushed the feeling away. Isa had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Months passed, and Brandon immersed himself in work, rebuilding the life Isa had almost ruined. He sold the house, too full of painful memories, and moved into a sleek downtown apartment. He traveled, took up new hobbies, and even started dating again. But no matter how much he moved on, the shadow of what had happened still lingered. Every now and then he found himself wondering about Isa and the baby. Were they okay? Was he doing the right thing? One rainy afternoon, his curiosity got the better of him, and Brandon drove to the address his investigator had provided. The apartment building was run down, with peeling paint and trash strewn across the yard. He sat in his car, watching the entrance. After about an hour, he saw her Isa, but not the vibrant woman he once knew. This Isa was thin, almost gaunt, her once stylish clothes replaced by a worn uniform. She struggled up the steps, a crying baby in one arm and a bag of groceries in the other. For a moment, Brandon's hand hovered over the door handle. Should he get out, offer her help? But then he remembered everything she'd done, every lie, every manipulation. No, this was her choice, her consequence. He started the car and drove away, pushing down the conflicting emotions that threatened to surface. As he merged onto the highway, his phone rang. It was Sarah, his lawyer. "Mr. Hale, I've got some news. Miss Hale is trying to reopen the custody case. She's citing financial hardship and requesting child support." Brandon's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Can she do that?" "She can try," Sarah replied. "But given the evidence we presented in the original case, her chances are slim. Still, I wanted to give you a heads up. How would you like to proceed?" Brandon was silent for a moment, weighing his options. Then his resolve hardened. "Fight it, use everything we have. I want this shut down quickly and definitively." "Understood, Mr. Hale. I'll keep you updated." As he ended the call, Brandon felt that familiar cold determination settle in. Isa was trying to worm her way back into his life, to manipulate him again. He wouldn't let that happen, not now, not ever. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal battles. True to form, Isa fought fiercely for child support, but the evidence Brandon had collected was irrefutable. The courts swiftly dismissed her case, leaving her with no options. After the final hearing, Brandon found Isa waiting for him outside the courthouse. She looked terrible, dark circles under her eyes, her clothes hanging loosely on her frail frame. "Brandon, please," she rasped, her voice hoarse. "I'm begging you. If not for me, then for your son. He needs you." Brandon stopped and looked at her, his expression cold. "He's not my son, Isa. He's your tool, your trap, and I'm not falling for it." Isa's face crumpled. "How can you be so heartless? This isn't the Brandon I married." "You're right," Brandon replied, his tone firm. "I'm not the man you married. That man was weak, easily manipulated. You made sure he doesn't exist anymore." He turned to walk away, but Isa grabbed his arm. "What happened to you?" she whispered. "Where's the kind, loving man I fell in love with?" Brandon jerked his arm free, his eyes flashing with anger. "He died the day he realized his entire marriage was a lie. You killed him, Isa, with every manipulation, every deceit." Isa stumbled back, shock written across her face. I never meant to." "Save it," Brandon cut her off. "I don't want to hear your excuses. It's over, Isa, for good this time." As he walked away, he could hear her sobs echoing against the courthouse walls, but he didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. That night, Brandon sat in his apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He stared out at the city lights, his mind replaying the events of the past year, the betrayal, the heartache, and the cold satisfaction of revenge. He pulled out his phone and opened his photo gallery. There, hidden deep in a folder he rarely visited, was a picture from happier times, him and Isa on their wedding day, both of them smiling, full of hope for the future. For a moment his finger hovered over the delete button. It would be so easy to erase this last remnant of their life together, but something stopped him. Instead, he closed the gallery and opened his email. With steady hands, he typed a message to his lawyer. "Sarah, I've been thinking about the custody situation. While I still stand by my decision not to be part of the child's life, I don't want him to suffer for Isa's mistakes. set up a trust fund for his education and basic needs. But make it clear this doesn't change anything between Isa and me. Brandon hit send before he could second-guess himself. This wasn't about forgiveness. He would never forgive Isa for what she had done, but it was something. A final acknowledgement of the life they once shared and the future they had once envisioned together. As he turned off his phone and got into bed, a sense of closure washed over him. It was truly over. Isa's life would continue to unravel, a slow descent into the consequences of her choices, while he would move forward, carrying the lessons he had learned but leaving behind the burden of hatred and revenge. In the end, Brandon understood that the best revenge wasn't in destroying Isa's life, but in living his own, free from her manipulations and lies. He had won, not by sinking to her level, but by rising above it. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Tomorrow was a new beginning, the first day of the rest of his life, and he was ready to face it, stronger and wiser than ever before. Across town, in a small, shabby apartment, Isa sat on a worn-out couch, cradling her restless baby. She stared blankly at the wall, her once pristine appearance now a faint memory. The room was cluttered with overdue bills and eviction notices. The fridge was nearly empty, and the rent was past due. This was her reality now, a stark contrast to the luxury and security she once enjoyed. As she rocked the baby, tears silently rolled down her cheeks. She had lost everything: her home, her status, her financial stability. But more than that, she had lost Brandon, the man she had manipulated and betrayed, yet in her own twisted way, the man she had truly loved. Now, surrounded by the ruins of her life, Isa finally understood the true cost of her actions. She had played a dangerous game and lost spectacularly. As the baby's cries echoed through the bare apartment, she realized that this crushing poverty, this intense loneliness, was her penance. She had tried to trap Brandon with a child, to control him through deceit and manipulation. Instead, she had trapped herself in a life she was completely unprepared for. As dawn broke over the city, two lives continued on their separate paths: Brandon, toward a future filled with hope and hard-earned wisdom, and Isa, toward a future of hardship and regret, forever haunted by the consequences of her betrayal. The game was over, and in the end there were no real winners, only lessons learned at a price too high to pay.